When a powerful lawyer loses everything to a betrayal, she's left homeless and alone, until an unlikely ally shows her the path to redemption. Can she reclaim her life, or will her past drag her down for good? Dive into this gripping tale of resilience and unexpected friendship on LifeStory Chronicles. Vivian King felt her pulse quicken as she pushed through the heavy glass doors of the law firm, heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floors. Today was supposed to be a routine morning, another day of conquering courtroom battles and drafting ironclad deals. But something felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. The whispers, the sidelong glances from her colleagues, each one jabbed at her confidence like a pinprick. Her boss, Mr. Edwards, was waiting by her office door, arms folded and eyes narrowed. "Vivian," he said curtly, gesturing her into the office. She followed, the weight of his gaze bearing down on her like a storm. "Explain this," he said, dropping a folder on the desk. Vivian opened it, confusion flooding her face as she scanned the pages. Emails and documents with her name on them implicated her in a leak she hadn't heard about. I didn't send these," she stammered, struggling to find the right words. "This isn't me." Mr. Edwards's eyes turned cold. "Save it for the board," he replied. "For now you're suspended, effective immediately." Her breath caught, and suddenly the room felt too small. Security was already waiting at the door. As they led her out, Vivian's gaze met those of her colleagues, who looked at her not with sympathy, but with something worse, judgment. In that moment, her life, her reputation, and everything she'd worked for slipped through her fingers. The cold gnawed at Vivian as she stumbled down the sidewalk, clutching her purse like it might hold the last of her pride. After her accounts had been frozen and her cards declined at every turn, the reality of her situation hit hard. She was utterly alone with no lifeline, no one to call. Her perfectly tailored coat and designer shoes felt like mockeries of the woman she once was. As she slumped against a streetlight, trying to ignore the growling in her stomach, a gentle voice called out from nearby. "You look like you could use something warm." Vivian looked up to see a man in a worn coat, holding out a small paper cup filled with soup. His face was roughened by the elements, his eyes tired yet kind. It took her a moment to understand what he was offering, and to swallow her pride enough to accept it. "No need to be ashamed," he added softly. "Everyone's down sometimes." Reluctantly, Vivian took the cup, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and something else she couldn't name. She sipped the soup, feeling its warmth spread through her, realizing just how cold she'd been. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to meet his gaze. He nodded, understanding more than she expected. "Name's Thomas. Stick with me. Streets are easier when you've got someone watching your back." As they walked together into the shadows, Vivian felt a sliver of safety. But the fear remained. She had no idea what was coming next. Vivian trailed behind Thomas, clutching her thin coat tighter against the biting wind as he led her to a dimly lit shelter nestled between two towering buildings. Inside, the air was warm but heavy, filled with the quiet murmurs of people sharing stories of hardship and resilience. Vivian felt out of place in her polished clothes among the worn jackets and tired faces, yet somehow, she sensed the shelter had its own strange kind of peace. Thomas handed her a plastic tray with a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. "Take it slow," he said. "Food's precious here." Vivian sat beside him, watching others in the shelter, a young woman with a baby bundled in her arms, and an elderly man reading a dog-eared book. These were lives she'd never looked at before, people she'd once hurried past on her way to work. She sipped her soup slowly, the taste grounding her in a reality she'd never imagined she'd face. Each mouthful reminded her of everything she'd lost, but also stirred something unexpected, a growing awareness of the strength it took to survive here. "People here stick together," Thomas whispered. "We share what little we have." As she finished her meal, Vivian felt a flicker of gratitude, unfamiliar yet comforting. She looked around, beginning to see each person not as a stranger, but as a community, each of them bound by circumstances and silent understandings. And in that moment, she realized survival wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about finding strength in each other. Vivian settled into the shelter's routine, learning when meals were served, how to find a safe place to sleep, and which shelters to avoid. Thomas became her guide, explaining the unspoken rules of survival. One evening, as they sat outside the shelter beneath a flickering street lamp, he began to share his story. "I wasn't always here," he said, his voice calm but layered with pain. "Used to be an architect. Had a family, a life. But one bad decision, one wrong partnership, and it all vanished." Vivian listened, her heart tightening as she saw the depth of his loss. For the first time, she realized how similar their stories were. Both had been on top, and both had fallen because of someone else's greed. She hesitated, but eventually opened up about her own life, her career, her betrayal, her helplessness. "Sounds like Caldwell's handiwork," Thomas muttered, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. She blinked, stunned. "You know him?" Thomas nodded. "I crossed him once, too. He crushed me." In that moment, their shared pain became a bond, transforming Vivian's sense of shame into a fierce determination. Together, they made a silent pact. They would bring Caldwell down not only for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered at his hands. As they sat in the shadows, a plan began to form between them. For the first time, Vivian felt a spark of hope, a way forward, a way to fight back. The next morning, Vivian and Thomas huddled together in a quiet corner of the shelter, their heads bent over a crumpled piece of paper where they scribbled down ideas. Vivian's resolve had hardened overnight. The desperation she'd once felt had transformed into a fierce purpose. She would not only reclaim her life, but also stop Caldwell from crushing others under his greed. "We'll need evidence," Thomas murmured. "Anything that can expose him." Vivian nodded, biting her lip. "There were files I worked on, records Caldwell thought he hid well. I know some people who used to respect my family. They might still help if they knew the truth." Thomas's eyes lit up. "I know where he keeps his records. There's an old warehouse he uses as a front. It's risky, but we might be able to find something there." Excitement flickered within Vivian, mingling with fear. They crafted a plan. Thomas would use his knowledge of the streets to slip into the warehouse, while Vivian would reach out to one of her father's old lawyer friends who despised Caldwell. Their ally could help bring the evidence to light. As the day faded, a steely determination set in. They would do this together, two unlikely partners united by shared loss. But the chapter ended with a note of suspense. Caldwell had spies everywhere, and one of them had seen them whispering. Unbeknownst to Vivian, their every move was being watched, and the clock was ticking faster than she realized. Under the cover of night, Vivian and Thomas made their way through the maze of streets toward the old warehouse. The building loomed ahead, its metal exterior rusted and peeling, surrounded by chain-link fences. They knew Caldwell had chosen this place for its isolation, assuming no one would dare look here. "Stay close," Thomas whispered as they slipped through a gap in the fence. Inside, the warehouse was dark and quiet, save for the hum of machinery somewhere in the distance. Shadows loomed across stacked crates, making it feel more like a labyrinth than a storage space. Thomas led her through the aisles, his knowledge of the place evident in his careful steps. Finally, they reached a locked office at the back of the warehouse. Vivian's pulse quickened as she crouched beside the door, watching Thomas skillfully pick the lock with a makeshift tool. With a faint click, the door swung open, revealing stacks of files and a computer, humming softly. "Here it is," Thomas murmured, flipping through documents, while Vivian photographed each one on her phone. Each file painted a picture of Caldwell's corruption, illegal deals, fabricated reports, and lists of people he'd ruined. Their victory was short-lived. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, and a flashlight beam swept past the door. They froze, hearts pounding, as a guard's voice called out, "Who's there?" Vivian exchanged a tense glance with Thomas, knowing one wrong move could ruin everything. They had the evidence, but now they had to make it out alive. With adrenaline coursing through her veins, Vivian grabbed Thomas's arm, and they ducked into the shadows just as the guard entered the office. Heart racing, she felt the weight of the evidence pressing against her as they huddled together, listening to the footsteps grow nearer. "Did you hear something?" the guard muttered, shining his flashlight across the room. They held their breath, praying for the beam to pass over them. Finally, it moved away, and they seized the chance to slip out the back door. Once outside, they sprinted toward the nearest street, blending into the darkened alleyways. As they ran, Vivian's mind raced with thoughts of what they could do with the evidence. With the right contacts, they could expose Caldwell's corrupt practices. But would it be enough to protect them? In the following days, they worked tirelessly, delivering the files to her father's old lawyer friend. Together, they presented the evidence to the authorities. Caldwell's empire began to crumble as investigations were launched, and soon, news outlets were covering the story. The moment Vivian received a call confirming that Caldwell had been arrested, tears of relief streamed down her face. She had taken back her life and transformed her pain into a powerful force for change. As she and Thomas celebrated their victory, Vivian realized that the experience had changed her forever. They had faced their demons together, and in doing so, she learned the most important lesson. True strength lies not in standing alone, but in lifting others up, forging connections in the face of adversity. As we conclude this powerful journey of resilience and transformation, remember that every story holds the potential to inspire change. At LifeStory Chronicles, we believe in the power of sharing experiences, both the struggles and triumphs. If you enjoyed this tale and want to see more stories that challenge, uplift, and connect us all, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your voice matters, and your story could be the one that sparks hope in someone else. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an inspiring episode.